Welcome Solid Source. I'm Derek Varnadoe.
And I'm Andrew Grattan, your in-house counsel. And we're here today to talk about some frequently asked questions and provide some advice on how to avoid last-minute closing delays.
Absolutely, some tips and strategies to help you navigate your transaction as well as your timelines. So Andrew, if you're ready, let's go ahead and jump in with repairs versus price reductions. Oftentimes, the due diligence period, especially right after we receive that home inspection report or whatnot, can be one of the most challenging parts of any real estate transaction. So sometimes knowing should we request repairs, should we simply ask for a price reduction, can be a tricky spot. So let's discuss options when it comes to repairs versus price reductions.
So one of the things I like to tell agents, if we're working with buyers, is to talk to them at the outset when we go ahead and order that inspection and say, hey, look, an inspector's job is to find everything that could possibly be wrong with this property. So you're going to get a report back. It's going to be fairly lengthy, and it's going to have all kinds of things about this property that aren't in working order. And then at that point to talk to the buyer and say, but understand that when we go in to ask for repairs, we want to make sure that we're asking for the things that you can't live without. Meaning, are these things that have to be repaired in order for you to go ahead and close on the property? So then we've narrowed it down. Well, first we've tempered their expectations, and then we've sort of narrowed it down to the things that are really key. And at that point, if we are going to go ahead and ask for some of the big ticket items, we'll throw those on our amendment to address concern. However, the alternative is if we've got our buyer saying, look, I'm thinking 15, 20 things that I want repaired, might want to at that point start talking to them about, hey, look, sometimes with repairs, when we go in there, there are issues that arise later on, 2 days, 1 day before the closing. At this point, would you consider maybe asking for the seller to go ahead and reduce the sales price or just contribute to your closing costs so that's money in your pocket that you could go ahead and do the repairs after you've closed on the home?
I like what you honed in on with big ticket items, because when it comes to things like the HVAC system, maybe the roof, those may be things that a buyer does want to go ahead and ask for. But at the end of the day, if it is something that can be solved monetarily with money, most folks are happier in the end. And if it is a situation where we do have to go ahead and ask for repairs to be made, the more specific we can be on that amendment to address concerns, the better. We really want the amendment to address concerns to be a standalone document that a stranger to the contract, for example, could read and understand exactly what we're asking for, because oftentimes it can be problematic if we reference an inspection report or if we expect the inspection report to do the talking for us. We really do want that amendment to be thorough enough that it could be a standalone document.
I agree, because sometimes when we throw in the language of the inspector from the report, it actually doesn't put an affirmative obligation on the seller to really do anything. So for example, if the inspection report says, meaning I, the inspector, recommend doing this, and we put that in there, recommend seller repair X, Y, and Z, the seller could get creative and say, hey, I just agreed that you recommended that. I didn't agree to actually do the repair. Now that's rare that would happen, but we just want to avoid that altogether by making our special stipulation, or our amendment to address repairs with the property, actually put the seller to the test and have him actually repair things and tell him what to repair, be specific, when to repair it by, 1, 2, 3 days before closing. Who's going to repair it? Is it the seller who's a handyman? Is he going to do it? Are we going to have a licensed contractor go out and repair it? And we might even want to consider asking for receipts or invoices to show that the work was done.
Absolutely. I love what you threw in about the time frame, because oftentimes the question will arise when we have an executed amendment to address concerns, how long does the seller have to actually complete those repairs? And unless we have specified that the repairs are to be completed within X number of days prior to closing, the seller would theoretically have through the date of closing to complete those repairs. And I love it when a buyer has a re-inspection. Oftentimes the home inspector for a small fee will go back out and re-inspect, not the whole entire property again, but at least those items that were in question. And at the very least, so important for a buyer to do that final walkthrough, because once the deal is closed, our obligations at that point do end. Another topic that I want to discuss today is earnest money. So earnest money is always a hot potato, so to speak. And I think with earnest money, the first point I really want to discuss today is how important it is for agents, particularly when we are representing the seller, to confirm that the earnest money has been turned in, because oftentimes when I am assisting agents or reviewing transactions and there may be a few hiccups along the way, a common thread is earnest money. And so if that earnest money is not turned in on time, there are certain tasks that the holder, certain steps that the holder needs to take in terms of notifying the parties, etc. But making sure that earnest money turned in is really big.
And going to the source, I don't want to say that we want to make the other agent think that we don't trust them, but
Right.
just asking the other agent, hey, has your buyer turned in the earnest money? I don't think that's good enough. I want to go to the holder named in the contract. So if it's Solid Source, calling Solid Source. If it's another broker, calling that broker and saying, hey, I'm the listing agent for 123 Main Street. I want to confirm that this earnest money has been turned in. And so that way you don't have a situation where maybe a check is shown to you by another party in the transaction, but it actually wasn't turned over to the holder.
In most other real estate companies and even attorneys' offices, I know it's becoming increasingly common for attorneys to hold funds, and oftentimes that can be a good idea, and we can talk about that, but there's going to be some sort of receipt. For example, if Solid Source Realty is the earnest money holder and a party remits earnest money to us through the earnest money website, you will receive an earnest money receipt. It'll be an emailed receipt, but from us. So there's usually some sort of receipt that can be received, not just merely a copy of the check from the other agent. Some things to consider. I know I just mentioned closing attorney serving as holder. It can be a great idea, especially when the earnest money is a large amount, if it's more than what we anticipate that the commission is going to be. But the attorney doesn't represent the buyer or the seller. For example, if the buyer's broker is holding the earnest money and they have a client relationship with that buyer and there are any issues and the holder needs to step in and make some decisions, there might be that bias there. So an attorney is oftentimes in a great position to truly look at the contract terms and make more of an unbiased decision as to who should receive the earnest money. I know Weissman has consistently done a really good job serving as the earnest money holder.
And just like Solid Source, Weissman has an option to submit the earnest money online via ACH transaction.
Another topic I want to step in and discuss today is appraisals, and not so much the appraisal itself, but really the steps that we as agents take prior to listing a property or prior to making an offer in terms of a comparative market analysis. When we go to do that CMA, and I'm thinking about this a little bit more from the listing standpoint, but let's go ahead and just continue to collect data along and along. Let's keep those comps that we pulled when we went to list the property. Let's keep a list of those repairs or upgrades that the seller has made to the property and have a nice little appraiser's package and go ahead and have that readily available in the home so that way when buyers are previewing the property and later on down the road when an appraiser is coming into the property, they have all of the information in one nice, neat package.
Right, and two, from the buyer's side, you want to make sure that when you're looking at a property or your buyer wants to make an offer on a property, that you're doing the same thing. You're pulling comps. You're getting some good, true comparables so that when the buyer makes an offer and we get a contract and it comes appraisal time, we're not going to be let down from it coming in below the price that we put in our contract. Additionally, FMLS YouTube channel has a great video on how to do their CMA through FMLS, so I would recommend checking that out too.
And the more familiar that we can be with a neighborhood, the better. As you mentioned, from the buyer standpoint or the seller standpoint, if we're familiar with what properties similar to ours have sold for, what properties maybe a little bit lesser or a little bit greater have sold for, it just helps to really set those proper expectations with our clients. And in the off chance that an appraisal does come up low, from time to time, this question will come in about challenging an appraisal. Regardless of which side we're on, we would really want to have the buyer's support and the lender's support in order to do that. And if that is the road, if that is the path that is chosen, oftentimes there will need to be some changes to the contract. For example, an amendment to change the closing date, to push things back, to extend the financing and appraisal contingency. Usually those are some of the contractual changes that will need to be made.
And that's a really good point because the GAR financing contingencies, whether it's conventional or VA or doesn't put anything in there about challenging an appraisal. That's something that is outside of the contract terms. And so making sure that we extend, if we're doing a conventional loan, to extend that appraisal contingency if we can. Of course, we're going to need the seller's consent to protect our buyer while we go through the challenge process.
Absolutely. So, quick pop quiz. Do you know what an amendatory clause is?
I do.
So, oftentimes this comes up. Well, I'll let you go ahead and tell me what it is.
The amendatory clause is applicable only to FHA or VA. And that clause basically states in no uncertain terms that the buyer will not have to complete the purchase of the property if the appraisal comes in at any number less than what we have in our contract. So there is a spot there on the FHA and the VA where we will put an amount that it has to appraise for, and we want to make sure that that is also, the purchase price that we have on the first page.
I love some of the unique terms that some contracts use. So, amendatory clause, you're absolutely correct, of course, is something that's unique to the FHA and VA financing exhibits, and basically it is the appraisal contingency. So great job. Now, one thing I will say, don't be completely surprised if the lender does come back and ask for their own amendatory clause. Typically, it's just a one-page document that basically is going to mirror word for word exactly what the GAR financing exhibit does. Oftentimes, they just simply want their own version of the form signed, so don't be alarmed if that happens. Usually that is not going to be an issue.
And that comes up usually at the closing table, but there are some lenders who a week out from closing will say, hey, let's go ahead and get this signed. So that's a great point.
While we're doing pop quizzes, so what about Tidewater? Do you know what Tidewater is?
I do. That process is unique to VA, and that essentially means that the appraiser believes that it's going to come in short. And so he starts the Tidewater initiative process, which is similar to the challenging of the appraisal that we spoke about earlier.
Absolutely. More of a heads up, more giving you the opportunity at that point, again, going back to those comps, to say, oh, well, okay, well, let me go back to my package here, to my comps that I pulled whenever my buyer went to make the offer or whenever we went to list the property, so that I can demonstrate to you why the property is worth what the buyer and seller feel that it is within their contract.
And that's a really great point. Going back to what you said about having that package ready to go, if we have a listing that's sat on the market for a little while too, constantly updating it to make sure that, if properties are selling within that neighborhood during the pendency of our listing, we can go ahead and update and get true comparables throughout the process.
Absolutely. And those FHA appraisals do stick with the property for 6 months. So let's just say we're in a situation where a property does appraise for a little bit less. Let's just say $2,000, and we have a seller that doesn't necessarily want to reduce the price. Something to think about is, do we want to start all over with another buyer, or would we simply prefer to reduce the price just a little bit? And a fun question sometimes that goes along with that is, well, does that mean that the seller can't sell the property to any other buyer for greater than that price? And really, no, it just means any other buyer who's seeking FHA financing, though, is not going to be able to receive a loan for higher than what it appraised at. So that leads me to another fun topic, and that is legal descriptions. And so these are imperative, because every contract that we write needs to include a complete legal description. Of course, we need to be able to identify the property that we're working with, or at least a key where a party can locate a complete legal description of the property.
And so kind of thinking of the hierarchy of legal descriptions, of course, having a copy of the vesting deed that went into our seller is the best case scenario. Attach it to the contract, that's great. That's not always available. Now, I will say Sherry Gill over at Weissman has access to the GSCCA, and she can pull that deed for you to throw and attach it to our contract. Second best scenario, you'll see there on the GAR contract, it does have a place to put the deed book and page, and that deed that they're referencing will be the vesting deed, and it'll have that complete legal description, and that's perfectly sufficient. A couple of places to find that. You can look on the Realist tab on FMLS, or just simply go to the tax assessor's website for that particular county. They're all different in the way they're laid out, but most of them, if you're able to find the property by either looking at the address or the owner's name, you'll find a section, usually it's sales, I believe, or past sales, something to that effect, where it'll show the deed book and page and our owner's name there so that you could plug that into your contract.
Absolutely. On FMLS, if you're in Realist, it's under the last market and sales history. Most of the time, the deed book and page number is going to be there. One thing I love, though, about whether it's looking on Realist or definitely when it comes to obtaining a copy of the actual deed and attaching that as an exhibit, tip for listing agents: when you go to list the property, that's the perfect time. You've got a little bit of leeway before you're going to have an offer come in, and the seller may very well have a copy of their deed and they can go ahead and provide it. What I love about the deed, though, it helps to confirm the parties that we're working with. Because let's just say that we've been speaking with Jane Doe, and then we get a copy of that deed and it mentions John and Jimmy and Louise, etc. At that point, we've got a little bit of a red flag waving at us, and we might want to investigate a little bit further.
Same too, if we're working with Jane Doe and our deed has Jane Smith, that sort of tips us off that perhaps Jane has either gotten married or is no longer married.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Andrew, thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise. I think we've covered a lot of great tips to help us be proactive, to help avoid those last-minute closing delays. Of course, should you have any questions or concerns regarding any of the information that we covered today or any other topics, please feel free to give us a call. We would love to talk with you and help you through your transaction.